Hey guys, and welcome to episode 2 of my Patreon-only Chris What series. In today's episode, I'll be looking in detail at the phone data and Chris's GPS records in the lead up to the murders to determine, with as much accuracy as possible, the time of the murders and whether he had enough time to commit this crime alone. So I hope everyone's having a good week so far. We've got bloody COVID in my house. First time, literally thought I had a superior immune system or something. I was like smugly walking around like this virus ain't got nothing on me. And then, oh shit, of course you've got it because, fucking everyone has COVID. We're not feeling too bad, thankfully. It's just been like a kind of baddish cold and some sniffles. Baby's doing fine. Hasn't even affected her sleep, which is nothing short of a miracle, and obviously makes me very happy. You can probably still hear it a bit in my voice, but I always sound a little bit hoarse and congested, so you probably just think I'm permanently ill or something, which I'm not. I'm just a little bit manly. Anyway, we're all on the mend, and so I'm super grateful that it didn't hit us that bad. Okay, enough of my mini dramas. Let's crack on with the video. So before we start, just as like a little preamble, in my view, this evidence is probably one of the most overlooked pieces of evidence for us to try and establish a timeline of the events that took place before Chris leaves for Survey 319. I didn't include this in my main podcast series because I think it needs this video content to accompany it because it's quite in depth, and I kind of wanted to save it for my paying only listeners. You're welcome, by the way. Okay, so for the purposes of this video, I'm going to analyze Chris and Shanann's health app data from their respective iPhones, as well as Chris's GPS records from his work truck. So let's kick off with the health app data. As most of us know, the iPhones come with this health app as standard, which kind of just runs along in the background and tracks things like movements and steps and various other things. I personally don't use this app too much, only if I've done like a shit ton of walking and I'm just a little bit curious to see how many steps I've taken. But I'm fairly familiar with the app, and hopefully this will translate in this video. Let's start with Chris's work phone. The quality of the images isn't great, I'm not going to lie to you. I've copied them from the discovery documents and they were pretty damn awful in there, so they're obviously not going to copy over very well. But I've also added text, and hopefully that will help to illustrate my points in this video. August 12th, as we can see, there's hardly any activity here. We know that he was at Jeremy's house for Jeremy's son's birthday, and so we can assume that he probably left his work phone at home. There's some activity in the afternoon and evening, which I assume is when he was communicating with his co-workers about him going out to Survey first thing in the morning, and he was kind of saying, for God's sake, nobody else come out to this site. I don't need you there. I need my private time, which translates to, I'm wiping out my entire family. Please don't turn up at the site because that will really fuck me over. August 13th, there's nothing until around 4 to 5 a.m. when there are some very minor movements detected, and from this we know that he's awake. Between 5 and 6 a.m, we can see there's a flurry of activity, and we know this is when Chris is frantically running around his house and packing up his work truck before he heads out to survey. Between 6 and 7 a.m, again, very minor activity recorded, and this is because during this time, he would be driving out to the site. Between 7 and 10 a.m. is the most activity recorded for that day, and this is because I believe during this time, he's disposing of the bodies and starting on the day's work. We know his job is really manual, and so it's not surprising to see the spike during these hours. Added to this, we know from the timeline that he was tottering around between these hours, making all his various ridiculous phone calls to ensure he raised suspicion with pretty much everyone he knew. We can also assume, given this data, that he had his work phone on him throughout the duration of his mad murder rampage. I'm sure he did this to ensure that he was on top of any updates coming in from co-workers to say that they were heading out to the work site. Moving on to Chris's personal phone. August 12th, between 11 and 12 a.m, Chris takes over 200 steps. We know he is awake between this time because he had the notorious 111-minute call with NK from around 9:30 to 11:19 p.m. And his last text to Shanann was at 11:21 p.m. when he told her he'd fallen asleep. Because, he's a lying sack of shit. Between 12 and 4 a.m., there is no activity recorded on his phone. This syncs with his work phone, and so I'm fairly confident in saying that he was probably asleep, or at least pretending to be asleep, during this period. This is crucial because we know that during this time, Shanann arrives home. Between 4 and 5 a.m., there's minor movements again syncing with his work phone, and so we know he's awake, but he's not making many movements, logging only around 20 to 30 steps. Between 5 and 6 a.m., again, this looks very similar to his work phone movements, and so I assume he had both phones in his possession when he was loading his work truck. Between 6 and 7 a.m., again, there's not much to see because during this time he was driving to Survey. And lastly, let's look at Shanann's phone data. So we pretty much know what she was up to on the 12th of August, so I'm going to skip straight to the morning of the 13th. Between 12 a.m. and 1 a.m., around 100 steps are recorded. During this time, Shanann would have been waiting at the airport and flying back to Colorado, and so we wouldn't expect to see much activity. Okay, so this bit is obviously really important between 1 and 2 a.m. So we can see around 800 steps recorded. From Shanann's phone records, she texts Cassie at 1:25 a.m. to tell her that they'd landed. As we all know, she arrives home at 1:48 a.m. I've Googled the distance between Denver Airport, which is where she landed, and 2825 Saratoga Trail, and it's about a 34-minute drive via the quickest route, and so I assume this text was sent to Cassie during the trip home. I'm guessing the majority of this activity was logged at the airport and perhaps maybe a small amount when she got home, and this is because between 2 a.m. and 3 p.m., there is no recorded activity on Shanann's phone. Then between 3 and 4 p.m., there's just over 400 steps, and this syncs with the time on the officer's body cam footage when Shanann's phone is discovered by Nicole's son, Nick, and subsequently turned on by Chris. Okay, so before I wrap this up in a nice, pretty theory time bow, just to make a few points about the iWatches. So there is no separate data included in the discovery documents about Chris and Shanann's iWatch records. Now, we know that they both had iWatches, and it's strange that nothing further is included. I've had another look at the body cam footage because I've never been looking out for this, but I cannot see that Chris was wearing his iWatch during the house search, and so I doubt he wore it at all that morning or that day. And further evidence of this can be seen in the fact that the data from the iWatch should sync with the data on the iPhone health app, but it clearly hasn't because we would have seen much more substantial movements for particularly the 13th of August. Also, on the 12th of August, Chris has a sleep analysis logged at 6 hours and 21 minutes. And on the 13th of August, there is no data recorded for his sleep activity. I'm guessing this is because he wasn't wearing the Apple Watch that night. I've also reviewed this YouTube video around the router information. That's right, guys, I get stuck down various rabbit holes with this case, but I've nearly wrapped it up and I think I need to move on with my life because it has just been a part of me for too long and it's just far too sinister. Anyway, so I watched this YouTube video and it's about the router information from the Watts' household. I've given credit to the creator of this video in the description. And from the information pulled from the router, there is no notable activity on the iPhones or iWatches until 5:25 a.m. on the 13th of August, when there is activity on Shanann's iWatch. Given that there's no recorded activity on her health app during this time, I think that the activity that's recorded at 5:25 a.m. as noted on the router is most likely Chris turning the watch off. Okay, so from my analysis of the health app data, and in my opinion, we can pretty much narrow down the time of the murders between 2 a.m. and 4:23 a.m. And the reason I say this is obviously there's nothing picked up on Shanann's phone after 2 a.m. And at 4:23 a.m., the downstairs Vivint system was triggered by someone walking down the stairs, which, as I said in the main podcast, in my mind, this is most likely Chris after he killed Shanann and starting his cleanup process. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say for the health app data, and hopefully that's covered that off sufficiently. I want to now move on to the GPS on his work truck, as well as Chris's early phone records. The reason I want to look at these in more detail is because I've heard tons of people say that it wasn't possible for him to act alone and that he didn't have enough time to drive out to Servi, kill his daughters, dispose of all the bodies and crack on with his actual day's work before his co-workers started to arrive at Servi. So, spoiler alert, I really don't agree with this view, and here's why. So at 5:45 a.m, Chris leaves his house and drives their 47-mile route to the oil site in Keensburg, Servi 319. At 6:31 a.m, Chris texts one of his co-workers, Cody Roberts, to tell him that he's at Servi. Now, he couldn't have arrived yet, seeing that it's a 47-mile route and he only left at 5:45 a.m, but it's most likely that he was probably at the Keensburg site, as from my understanding, it's bloody huge. At 6:41 a.m, he texts Chad McNeil to tell him again that he's at Servi. As before, I really don't think he was at the specific site that he was going to be working on and, disposing the bodies at this point, but he's obviously stopped to do the rounds to make sure no one shows up mid cover-up. At 6:53 a.m, Chris arrives at Servi 319 as shown on his GPS records, and his truck is turned off. So it's 47 miles. I'm going to hazard a guess to say it's unlikely that there was traffic at this time, although I don't live in the area. So what do I know? Maybe it's gridlocked at that time, but I just doubt it. So I'm guessing he probably pulled over a couple of times en route, but didn't turn his truck off because he knew if he did that, it would be logged in his GPS and it would look, quite suspicious. Not that he had to worry about that because the rest of his behavior would be majorly suspicious. From around 7:40 a.m. to 8:30 a.m, this is when Chris is making all his phony calls and texting Shanann, calling the girls' school and his realtor. At 8:30 a.m, his co-workers begin to arrive at Servi. Okay, so let's have a look at this timeline. Realistically, Chris had just under 2.5 hours to commit his despicable crimes. I don't want to go into too much detail again about the girls' murders because I've covered this in the main podcast series during episode 6, but I will say that, bearing in mind the way he disposed of their bodies, I wouldn't think the process was particularly time intensive. Okay, I'm not going to say much more on this, and just to say I really don't want to come across as being insensitive and that I'm trying to come at this from a factual viewpoint to try and get closer to the truth and maybe dispel some mistruths that I've heard about this case. In terms of Shanann's body, we know that he buried her in a very shallow grave and she was discovered curled up with her knees to her chest. During the main podcast, and my initial theory around this was because, he just rolled her in without a care in the world. Don't get me wrong, I still think that this applies, but I also think that this was tactical to save time by digging a smaller hole. Looking at the dirt at the site, to me, it seems very loose, almost like sand, and it looks like it would have been easy to dig the hole and also pile it back on. And so, again, I don't think it would have been very time intensive. Taking all of this information into account, in my view, there was definitely enough time for him to do everything he needed to do before his co-workers started to arrive at the scene. And so I do not think there was someone helping him to dispose of the bodies or assist him in the crime. That's it for this video, guys, and episode 2 of the Patreon only Chris Watts series. I hope you enjoyed this video and do let me know your thoughts in the comments or message me directly. Have a great week, everyone. Until next time.